So here we are, it's the week after Easter, and we are processing that story. We are thinking through what it means to have experienced Easter liturgically. At a lot of more traditional churches, this is the Sunday when the story of Doubting Thomas is remembered. It's the time when the church is still processing things. What is it that happened on Good Friday? What is it that happened on Easter Sunday? How does this affect our lives? How does it affect us internally? How does it affect us emotionally and spiritually? And in so many other ways. And it's an appropriate time to grapple with it because we remember, too, that the early church also had to grapple with this story and had to wrestle with it. One of the things that they grappled with as the Easter story spread is this kind of hole in the plot that happened. If you read through the Gospels, you see that on Good Friday, Christ dies, and then on Easter Sunday, he rises again. But there's that time in between, and the Gospels don't really treat it. And so the early church had to wrestle with that. What was it that Christ was doing during that time between Good Friday and Easter Sunday? And a few different theories were tossed around. One theory was that he just simply spent that time in heaven with God the Father. We have a medieval representation of that theory up here, and it's a terrible painting for a variety of reasons. I'm not 100% sure why, Christ made it all the way to heaven and no one bothered giving him a robe, or why, God the Father is dressed like the Pope there. But this is a problematic theory. For one thing, it kind of gives you this kind of elevator Jesus where, Christ starts off in heaven, comes down to earth to be born at Christmas, then he dies and goes straight back up to heaven, and he comes back down to be resurrected, and then a few weeks later at the Ascension he goes back up to heaven, but don't worry, at the second coming he's coming back down again, but then we're going right back up to heaven with him. So you kind of get like this divine whiplash thing, right? It's not a great story. It doesn't make for an effective filling in the hole in the plot. Another possible theory, and one that's admittedly much less popular, is the idea that Christ wasn't doing anything. I don't know if I have any Game of Thrones fans in the audience here, but one of the themes of that show is that there's a couple different characters that die and then come back to life. And it's an interesting treatment of this because invariably when they come back to life, everyone wants to know, like, what was there after you died? And the answer is always nothing. I experienced nothing. It was just blackness. And that's an interesting idea. The show's got an interesting worldview of this place where miracles and resurrection are possible, but there's maybe not an afterlife. That's obviously not a worldview that the early church was interested in. So while this has had a few proponents over the years, it never quite got popular. What they settled on, the idea that gained prominence in the first millennium of the church and really won the day up until really the Protestant Reformation, was an answer that had been used in a lot of other stories. It was an answer that is, I would dare say, the classical answer. It's an answer that we find in many different ancient stories, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. We've got the Aeneid by Virgil. We've got the Odyssey by Homer. The Legend of Orpheus, the Prose Edda, which is actually one of the best and earliest existing sources for Viking mythology. We've got the Egyptian Book of the Dead. We've got Dante's Divine Comedy. Unless you think that this was just an ancient answer, this is also an answer that comes up in a lot of modern movies and shows as well. For instance, in The Lord of the Rings, we have, after the shards of Narsil are reforged into Andúril, the Flame of the West, Aragorn goes deep into the mountain to claim the allegiance of the Oathbreakers, who were these dead guys in the mountain. That's the end of the nerd rant there, sorry. It's something that we see in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. In The Dark Knight Rises, we see Batman, his body utterly broken, thrown into this abyss of despair in which it is incredibly hard to make his way out to freedom. We even see it in children's movies. This is from Coco, and I don't know if you've had the chance to see Coco. This is probably the best children's movie I've ever seen. Honest to God, like I sat there in the theater with my kids and cried about 3 different times. This young man goes to the land of the dead on El Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, and is able to meet his great-grandfather. It's an absolutely incredible story. I highly recommend it. It's even an answer that Parks and Rec fell on. If you follow their first season, the entire story arc revolves around the pit. And the pit is this useless piece of land that is essentially just this big hazardous hole that many people fall into and is immortalized by a classic song by the band Mouse Rat. This answer that was used both ancient times and in modern times is the harrowing of hell. The harrowing of hell is quite simply this idea. After Jesus died on Good Friday, he descended to hell. Not because he was damned to hell or anything like that. No. The early church said that Christ descended to hell to liberate the souls that were there, to find the dead, to find Adam and Eve, as Kevin read from that sermon. That was an ancient sermon, by the way, by St. John Chrysostom. But it's this idea that Christ went to the dead to liberate the souls of those who were there. You will sometimes see this called the Descensus Averni. That's what it's called in the Aeneid. Or kind of from a more scholarly perspective, it's called catabasis. What I've got up here now is a 12th century icon from a Greek church. For some reason, this fell out of popularity in the West. I think I know why, but the Eastern Church still very much celebrates the harrowing of hell, and so it's still very much depicted in their iconography. And in fact, their Easter is today, and if you had gone to a Holy Saturday service yesterday, you would have seen a very rich liturgical celebration of the harrowing of hell. It's quite beautiful. But we have the harrowing of hell here, and I kind of want to just open it up. Yeah, as a teacher, it's difficult for me to just talk without getting reactions from all of you. So I want to open this up. What do you see in this picture? What stands out to you? Okay, the guy is the bridge. Who is that guy, do you think? Definitely Jesus up there. Who's the bridge? That's okay. I heard it. Somebody said it. Go ahead, Moses. What? Not Satan himself, but getting closer. You're warm. His skin is a darker shade than everyone else's because maybe he's got a little rigor mortis going on. It's death personified. To the left here, the people that Christ is taking by the hand here, to reference back to what Kevin read just a few minutes ago, what do you think those two people are? That's okay. Shout it out. All right, it's Adam and Eve. It is Adam and Eve, our first parents according to Genesis. And then to the left of Adam and Eve, you see a variety of souls from before Christ's time on earth. And over to the right, you've got the land of the living. And as Christ is pulling Adam and Eve out from hell, as he is pulling out our ancestors standing there behind them from hell, one of the things that I want to point out is around death's kind of a trampled self there, you'll notice there's a lot of keys and a lot of broken locks, actually. The idea that got presented in the early church was that the harrowing of hell was a final defeat for hell. It was a final defeat for death. This was a cosmic jailbreak in some ways. And I don't want to get too far off on a tangent, but the way this got interpreted in the early church, as I think you'll see in some of the readings I'm going to present in just a minute, is very much in a way that we in 2018 might say the idea is that love wins. That idea was not original to Rob Bell. Love very much wins in this icon. This harrowing of hell is an idea that we find attested to elsewhere in the New Testament. In 1 Peter 3, we read, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. And I don't think that Peter here just means the people that were literally there during the literal flood, right? I think that the idea here is that there is a history to humanity that Christ is preaching to, and it's not just the redeemed, it's not just the believers that Christ is preaching to here, it's the souls that are in prison from the flood that has happened throughout history. St. Ephrem the Syrian is a church father and absolutely standout amongst early hymn writers from the 3rd century. He writes about Holy Saturday that death finished his taunting speech, and our Lord's voice rang out thunderously in Sheol, tearing open each grave one by one. Terrible pangs seized hold of death in Sheol. You get the image here that death itself is dying. Where light had never been seen, rays shone out from the angels who entered to bring out the dead, to meet the dead one who has given life to all. Again, not to belabor the point, but the idea that love wins is an ancient one. From Kontakion 43 by St. Romanus the Melodist, who was about 5 centuries after St. Ephrem, still 1st millennium. Hades answered the wily one, that's the devil. Hades answered the wily one, let us both weep bitterly, since in his descent he has attacked my stomach, so that I vomit forth those whom I formerly devoured. It's beautiful imagery right there. But now lament with me, for we have been stripped of our glory, for Adam has been set free from my former chains. Adam here, I think, as is often the case in ancient liturgy and ancient hymns, Adam is a stand-in for all of humanity. For Adam has been set free from my former chains, and the prophet cries out, where is your victory, O Hades? Eve too rejoices, for she was saved by him who has destroyed the weapons of Belial, the victory of Hades, and the sting of death. And then to revisit just one short passage from what Kevin read to us earlier, what is happening? Today there is a great silence over the earth, a great silence and stillness, a great silence because the king sleeps. The earth was in terror and was still because God slept in the flesh and raised up those who were sleeping from the ages. God has died in the flesh and the underworld has trembled. So there you see the harrowing of hell really won the day in the early church. This was the theory for the first 1,000 years of the church. Why should we care today, though? Like I said, this is an idea. As someone that grew up in the evangelical world, I don't think that I ever heard this idea until probably well into my teen years, and I don't know if that was your experience as well growing up evangelical, for those of you that did. But this was certainly not an idea that was present. I think that Holy Saturday, the day that falls between Good Friday and Easter, was a day to dye Easter eggs and get ready for Easter. There was nothing that was presented as a theory to me. Why do we care today? Why is the harrowing of hell important? I think first let's talk about what hell actually is. In the Eastern Church, still today, and throughout the first millennium of the entire church, both Western and Eastern, you see this idea that hell is not actually like a literal place. Like you don't start digging into the ground, and after you dig for a while, well, there's hell somewhere in the underworld. That actually came much later. That didn't come until Dante wrote his Divine Comedy. And I think that the idea that the Divine Comedy served as a model for hell would have shocked and disappointed Dante, who I think very much meant it metaphorically and allegorically. But here, Aristotle Papanakolo, who is a professor at Fordham University, says, those theological symbols, heaven and hell, are not crudely understood as spatial destinations, but rather refer to the experience of God's presence according to 2 different modes. God is present everywhere. As Chris has pointed out in sermons over the last few months, God is in whom we live and move and have our being. You cannot go somewhere where God is not. And so therefore, heaven and hell are not places, but they are ways of experiencing God. They're ways of experiencing the divine light within. It is either a presence that you experience as joy and as life and as love, or it's an experience that you can have as despair and hopelessness and death. And that is the defining difference between heaven and hell, not a physical location. So I think that because of that, because we are all experiencing the divine presence all the time, because we all have that divine light within, because we are all living and moving and having our being in him, I think we all have a hell to harrow. That is, we all must descend to what is causing death and separation within us so that we can experience God's presence as love and joy and not as self-hatred and anxiety. In order to talk about how to do that, I want to visit briefly the world of Carl Jung. And I don't know if you all are familiar with Carl Jung. He was a father of psychoanalysis in the 20th century. He was something of a prodigal son to Freud. Freud kind of viewed him as his heir apparent until they had a great falling out. And Carl Jung wrote about the goal of life as being self-realization. That is to say, becoming who you are, becoming what you were created to be. How do you do this? Well, through a process called individuation, and that's basically, as we're going to talk about, connecting your conscious self with your subconscious self. And what's standing in the way of that is a whole lot of stuff that you haven't dealt with yet. So to talk about this, I want to just read a quote to you briefly. Jung said, "Real liberation comes not from glossing over or repressing painful states of feeling, but only from experiencing them to the full." So we go to hell. And I want to revisit this icon. I've kind of taken the liberty of adding a few labels to some of the things that I want to identify here. Carl Jung very much saw the self as being composed of parts. And I think that they're parts that we all have. Christ here, the cosmic Christ, the divine light within, I've got here represented as your true self, as who you are becoming. Death is what Carl Jung would have called the shadow. The shadow is those parts of yourself that you have consciously rejected. And we all have those things. It might be something that you were truly passionate about when you were younger, that you consciously rejected because of peer pressure, because of wanting to fit in. It might be your sexuality that you have repressed because of societal beliefs. It might be any number of things that you have rejected because either you were trying to please your parents, you were trying to gain the interest of a love interest, you were trying to fit in with a peer group at school. But we all have these things. And one of the things that Jung says is that to become yourself, you have to go to those things that have been put to death, that you have put to death. You have to incorporate them into yourself. Christ is standing on death in this icon, but in actuality, it's not standing on in the sense of just trampling, but also in a sense of incorporating the bridge there, of going back to those parts of yourself that you've self-consciously rejected. There's also the anima, and I've got the anima by Eve. The anima is your soul. Think about the word to reanimate something, to bring it back to life. The anima is what brings you life, and so often we ignore what brings us life. We ignore what we love. We ignore what we're passionate about for whatever reason. The anima in Jung's treatment of this, by the way, is female for men and male for females. It's kind of a contrasexual thing. But the anima here as Eve, I think, is appropriate because Carl Jung very much said that the anima for men in the subconscious very much takes on the figure of your mother. It's you're projecting onto what gives you life the image of your mother. Anyway, how's it going? My mom's over there. Then there's the personal subconscious and the collective subconscious. The personal subconscious is very much what you would expect it to be. These are the memories that you have tried to repress. These are the things that happened to you in your childhood that you'd rather not think about. And this is something that Freud and Jung had in common. They both talked about the personal subconscious. But there's more than that. There's also the collective subconscious. And this is actually where Jung and Freud differed from each other. Freud thought the idea of the collective subconscious was ridiculous. And I think this is where the Harrowing of Hell becomes a more compelling story than the other descents to the underworld that I talked about, where it becomes more compelling than Orpheus's trip to Hades, where it becomes more compelling than Dante's trip to the Inferno. Because there's a collective subconscious, and your collective subconscious is simply the idea that your subconscious is more than just your personal experiences. There are things that humanity has experienced. There are things that your ancestors experienced. There are things that the members of your family in your past have experienced that are still shaping who you are. Carl Jung said about the collective subconscious, every civilized human being, whatever his conscious development, is still an archaic man at the deeper levels of his psyche. Just as the human body connects us with the mammals and displays numerous relics of earlier evolutionary stages going back to even the reptilian age, so the human psyche is likewise a product of evolution which, when followed up to its origins, shows countless archaic traits. In science now, we are discovering something called epigenetics. And one of the things that we are discovering in epigenetics is that the things that your grandparents experienced, the things that your great-grandparents experienced, are still affecting you. They still have a bearing on your life. One of the fascinating things that they've discovered is that when they interview or when they do studies on the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors actually have lower cortisol levels than is typical in the population. And cortisol is a chemical in your body that helps you to deal with stress. And low cortisol levels are very much associated with people that have had post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what they are finding is that this trauma that was experienced by Holocaust survivors is very much passed down to grandchildren even. You know, this is kind of a sillier example personally. But I'm a stress eater, and when I get stressed out, I go straight to complex carbohydrates. Not simple carbs. I don't crave specifically complex carbohydrates. Your breads, your starches. And it didn't dawn on me until a couple of years ago that maybe that's because I'm a direct descendant of people that fled a potato famine in Ireland. Maybe I'm craving what my ancestors didn't have. I don't know. But there's this idea that all of us are shaped by not just our own personal experiences, but those people that came before us. And so I think in an effort to become who we are, to become a self-actualized person, there's a need to redeem history. There's a need to go all the way into that hell. There's a need to find out about who we were before we were us. There's a need to dig into your family's history and find out what is it about my collective subconscious that I'm experiencing that is keeping me from being the person that I'm supposed to be. What are the negative behaviors that I exhibit that are a result of this family history that I have? So that you can deal with them. Because by bridging the conscious and the subconscious, you are then able to deal with things. And like Carl Jung said, that's where true liberation happens. That's where the souls from hell are able to be freed, is when you are becoming yourself by dealing with those unconscious things. I think that's one of the powerful things too, by the way, about sharing communion together every Sunday. In communion, we recall a trauma that happened quite some time ago in all of our histories. We recall the betrayal that Christ experienced. We recall the unjust death that he experienced. And in reliving that trauma together, we are able to, I think, bridge the subconsciousness that we all share as a part of the church and really as a part of Western civilization. We're able to bridge that subconscious together into our consciousness so that we are then able to move forward into the Easter story. So as a teacher, like I said, I am going to have to offer you a summary here. What are we going to do to harrow hell together? I want us to assimilate the shadow. That is, to learn from the parts of yourself that you've consciously rejected. I want you to embrace the anima. That is, find what brings you life and love and peace. And finally, we've got to confront both the personal and the collective subconscious. That is, let's redeem history, both our own personal history and the history that we all share. Because we are not just a collective of individuals, we are something greater than that. Through this process of self-realization, that is, realize and becoming who you are, you'll harrow your own hell and live in greater awareness of your unbreakable connection to the one in whom we live and move and have our being. You'll also be ready to advance the kingdom. That is, you'll be more ready to fight to liberate others. One of the things that Carl Jung said was that a society made up of self-actualized individuals would not be subject to dictators. It would not be subject to unjust systems. They would not be susceptible to fascists taking over. And this is a man, by the way, who was very much a keen observer of both Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy as he was living in Europe during the 30s and 40s. And he said, if we had self-actualized individuals, this would not be happening right now. And so in our own day and time, when we look out and we see injustice and we see corrupt systems, as we are fighting to be self-actualized individuals, as we are fighting to become who we are, we will be better able to resist those systems of corruption and injustice we see around us. And we do this modeling ourselves after that great redemption story that we have been celebrating for the past week in Easter. 1 Peter 1 says, you know that you were ransomed from the feudal ways inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without defect or blemish. And I would be remiss if I didn't quote from Joey Camps, as Rachel calls him, one of my all-time favorite authors. Joseph Campbell, who wrote in a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, that pointed out these similarities between the Harrowing of Hell and other mythologies and kind of drew together a lot of the great religious traditions of the world, said, furthermore, we have not even to risk the adventure alone, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path. And where we had thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. Where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outward, we shall come to the center of our own existence. And where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world. All right. And with that, I wish you all a happy Sunday. Let's go forth and harrow our own house.